We kick off hour number 2 with our good friend. Haven't had him on in a while. He's a busy, busy man. Pro Football Focus's very own Sam Monson, lead analyst for Pro Football Focus, PFF.com, and co-host of the Pro Football Focus NFL pod. You go to PFF.com right now, Dirt. You can do a mock simulated draft with your team.
I did like 5 of them yesterday.
I mean, how do you not?
Once you do one, it's kind of addicting, and you want to keep doing it over and over and over again.
Sam, thanks for joining us. Good morning to you. I actually want to give you guys credit. We reference PFF all the time. We have a lot of you guys from PFF on the show. I believe you guys have finally found the NBA equivalent to the trade machine, but in the draft with the mock simulator. How much do you play with it?
Oh, yeah, it's extremely fun. You end up spending all day just going, dialing in on a particular team and going, all right, let's fix the Browns today with the mock draft sim, and spending half your morning just dialing it up in various different ways. It's fun.
When you look, every mock you do is going to turn out differently. To me, it's always fascinating to talk about quarterbacks in the first round, which guys are worthy of first-round picks, which guys are going to be reached for because teams are desperate for that. If you were a betting man right now, how many quarterbacks do you say go in the first round? And of those guys, how many of them in your mind are actually worthy of being a first-round pick?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like we're going to get 4 quarterbacks go in the top 10. Maybe one of those teams that needs a quarterback in sort of pick 11, 12, 13, I think it is, the Vikings, Raiders, Denver Broncos, a little trio there. Maybe those teams have the patience to wait it out and let one of the guys slide outside of the top 10, but I doubt it. I think someone's going to have to jump on that 4th guy higher up. And then it's a case of, does a 5th one end up in the first round? Does somebody pull the trigger on probably Michael Penix Jr. from Washington or Bo Nix from Oregon, and we get 5 in the first round? I think probably it just stays with the 4. We're going to get those 4 guys go early, and then teams are going to be reticent to grab the next one. But that's the question. We know we're going to get 4 taken in the first round. They're going to go pretty high, and then it's a case of, do we get that 5th with a team that's desperate enough?
Is there a quarterback amongst that you've seen some tape, you talk to people that for you're not necessarily connecting with, or do you like all 4?
No, it's funny. I think outside of Caleb Williams, I think there's a lot of question marks about this quarterback group. I think we are seeing a kind of product of the desperation of teams that need them. We know Washington is taking a quarterback. They need to. They're sitting there at 2. They traded away their guy, the one that they had last season, so they desperately need a starter. It's coming from this draft. The Patriots, similar kind of boat. They already traded away Mac Jones. They're starting afresh. We know that's happening. Denver, same thing with Russell Wilson. The Minnesota Vikings, they lost Kirk Cousins. So these teams, it's an unusual draft, I think, for teams that have already committed to getting rid of the guy they already had in the building and moving in a different direction. So that has to come from the draft, and it has to come from high up in the draft if you want to be confident in the player you're getting. So I think that's driving this sort of inflation or this reputation of this draft class. But the more I look at it, Caleb Williams is by far the best guy of the group. He's the number 1 prospect, and I think he is a legit, top-tier quarterback in any given draft class. But the rest of them, I think, all have pretty reasonable concerns. We're starting to see that more and more as the draft goes through, with Drake May in particular. He seems to be getting kind of picked apart by the industrial draft complex, by the machine. It's not really getting to Jaden Daniels as much, or J.J. McCarthy, but I think all 3 of those guys have some fairly scary flaws that would concern me if I was a team that wasn't picking number 1 overall.
I love that, the industrial draft complex. That we're going to steal that line. That is fantastic. I saw Jim Harbaugh had a quote the other day saying, if this turns out the way that it could, we might end up with what is the number 1 overall pick in the draft, because they don't need a quarterback in LA, and they're number 5. And if you get 4, they go right off the bat. They get their pick of the litter, everybody else. Is it as simple to say the Chargers or somebody else, but who benefits the most from maybe this run on quarterbacks early, of a player at a certain position falling to a team of need, or the Chargers trading out? Who do you think ends up benefiting the most in the top 10, because we might have this run on quarterbacks at the top?
Yeah, I think he's right. I mean, any of those teams that are picking in the second half of the top 10 are all looking at this and loving that idea. I mean, Tennessee potentially could benefit the most if, Joe Alt, the tackle from Notre Dame, he might be the top player on Tennessee's board, given their need on the offensive line and given what they want to do to set up Will Levis for success. It's possible that Joe Alt ends up being there at 7 when in a different draft, he would be maybe the number 2 overall pick as the first guy off the board after a quarterback had been selected. So, Tennessee, if they somehow manage to get that guy landing at number 7 because 4 quarterbacks went 1, 2, 3, 4, that would be an absolute dream for them. Any of these guys looking for a top wide receiver prospect as well. There's 3, I think, in this draft, that top trio of Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze. One of those guys might be available at the bottom of the top 10 that wouldn't be there normally because of this run of quarterbacks.
Sam Monson, our guest here, lead analyst for Pro Football Focus NFL Pod, PFF.com. You can do the draft simulator, go make a mock draft of any team, your favorite team, other teams. Sam mentions the Browns just out of curiosity. How can we make the Browns better? Kind of a two-parter. Your thoughts, I know you probably had initial thoughts, but your thoughts now being about a week removed from the Bills trading Stephon Diggs, what you thought of that, and the kind of no-brainer position you think Buffalo, because it feels like Buffalo's going to trade up and draft a receiver. Do you have that same feeling? Is there an obvious spot for you that would make sense for them to move up to?
Yeah, I mean, the reaction to the trade is they must have wanted that guy out of the building pretty desperately. This was not a move that happened as part of a plan. You look at the contract that they'd signed into, the extension. They had to eat $31 million of dead cap money to make this happen. This was not something that was planned from the outset. This wasn't the way it was always going to go down. And neither was the trade offer too good to turn down. Like, this wasn't something that just dropped in their lap and they went, well, we weren't planning on trading Stephon Diggs, but this trade is too good to turn down. They eventually just snapped and reached a point where they said, we have to get rid of this guy, and it has to be now. And so it's put them in this position where they really don't have anything like a top-tier wide receiver, and their first pick is 28. So you're right. The speculation is they're going to go on the move and try and fill that need and try and make it happen and try and trade up in the draft. It's a tough spot because we talked about that big trio of wide receivers probably all being gone in the top 10. So either they have to trade a long way from 27 overall up into the top 10 somewhere to get one of those guys, which seems almost prohibitively expensive. Obviously, the Falcons did that, a decade ago for Julio Jones, and it worked out pretty well for them. But that was a lot that they traded up, and the guy basically needs to be Julio Jones to justify the cost of what you give up in draft picks. The alternative is they trade up a little bit and go after wide receiver 4, whoever that is. It's Brian Thomas Jr. on most people's boards. I'm not as high on Brian Thomas as most, but trading up to that spot and try and secure the 4th best guy would be an option. I honestly think, though, the best thing they can do, the best way of playing the odds is to just sit there at 27, draft a wide receiver, and then draft a couple more later in the draft. I mean, they have 11 selections, I think, this year. 3 of them should go on wide receivers. Like, just play the odds and try and roll the dice as many times as possible. And maybe it's not the top guy that ends up being something good. It's the guy you get in the 3rd round or the 5th round. I mean, last year, Dontavian Wicks was the best young receiver that the Packers had, and I think he was the 3rd pass catcher that they selected in that draft.
We might be a little biased here. I think Neighbors is excellent. Obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr. for most kind of stands at the top. But we got to watch a lot of Rome Odunze out here. He was a nightmare for every team that we rooted for and every other team in the conference he played in. I tend to believe, I don't know if my co-host does, I think he's wide receiver too. Where are you at on Neighbors Odunze in the wide receiver power rankings of takes that might be wrong, but we won't think about it once their career gets going?
I think all 3 of those guys are special. Like, I think in most years, all 3 of those receivers would be the first receiver off the board. And it takes, a special year like this where the 3 of them are showing up at the same time. But, last year, any of those guys would be wide receiver 1. They would be the top receiver in that draft class. And in most draft classes, I think that would be the case. So I tend to stick with the sort of conventional order, actually. I tend to rank it Marvin Harrison, Neighbors, and then Odunze. But I really do think it's a razor-thin margin between all 3 of them. And I certainly wouldn't disagree with anybody that wanted to rank them in a different order. I think it's really close. And if you get one of those guys, as a wide receiver needy team, you've done extremely well.
You mentioned Sam Howell a couple of moments ago, and he's obviously in Seattle now, and they had Geno Smith, who was a really good story 2 years ago, and then not quite the same last year. And there's a lot of needs on Seattle's roster, there's no doubt. If John Schneider called you and said, hey, do you think we should take a quarterback in the first round, or kind of wait and see how it goes maybe in later rounds and maybe get one next year or later in the draft, what would the advice be on Seattle on that position?
I certainly wouldn't draft one in the first round. I think given where the Seahawks are picking, there's just not going to be a guy available at that spot that you have confidence in, being a franchise quarterback and being someone that completely transforms the fortunes of the team. I wouldn't be averse to taking one. I mean, Spencer Rattler is everybody's favorite kind of mid-round prospect in this draft, the guy that actually I think has NFL starting tools, but, has not necessarily played at that level throughout his entire career, lost his job to Caleb Williams at Oklahoma, had to kind of rebuild his career at South Carolina. He's got the capacity, the potential is there for him to develop into something, but that's why you take those guys in the mid rounds, because you're not confident that it's going to happen, but it's worth the roll of the dice somewhere. So I think Seattle coming out of this draft with a quarterback certainly makes sense, just not in the first round.
Get you out of here in this one, Sam, because we appreciate your time. Penix and Nix, two other guys we got to watch a lot of. They don't look like, I believe they both were not invited to the green room because they don't project high enough and they don't want an Aaron Rodgers situation looming. Penix and Nix, where are you at on both of them? Is there a franchise quarterback there? Or are these, good starters who may end up becoming back? How do you project out Penix and Nix?
Yeah, a couple of guys I think that each have question marks, very different, but they all have the potential to be starters. Nix, he's a unique prospect because we've literally never seen a player play that much in college. I mean, he started over 60 games in college. And there's so much bad on his tape, from Auburn before he became good, that I think it really sort of harms him in the eyes of many. Like if we had just seen the most recent stuff and he was a couple of years younger and he'd only been in college for, a couple of seasons, then I think his stock would be a lot higher. But with so deep into his career and so much bad on his tape, I think teams and a lot of evaluators are just kind of reticent to give him the full credit for what we've seen recently. And then Michael Penix, he's had such a roller coaster of a draft process, because I think if you take away the national championship game, I think we're talking about this guy maybe in that top 10 conversation with the other four quarterbacks. And then we had that game. It was so much worse than everything that had gone before it. And it's a case of how much do you weigh that? It's almost the reverse of what happened last year with C.J. Stroud, where the best thing we had seen from him was the most recent game. It was the Georgia game where he answered every question that everybody had about him as a prospect. And the question was, how much do you weigh that one game against a greater body of work that didn't look the same? Penix is the same thing, but the one game is negative. And I think people are leaning on that a lot because it's harder in the NFL. And that game looked a lot more like what Sundays look like for a lot of quarterbacks, where they're under pressure a lot more. Their offensive line doesn't necessarily hold up as well as it did every other game, and they have to deal in adverse circumstances, and Penix didn't perform well in those circumstances. So I think he's definitely got first-round ability, but he's being held back a lot by how badly his career ended in that one game.
Yeah, good stuff. Sam Monson, PFF, PFF.com _PFF Sam. You can find the mock simulator draft at PFF.com. Sam, we always appreciate the time. Thank you very much, sir.
Anytime, guys. Take it easy.
All right, there you go. Sam Monson, ProFootballFocus.com with his thoughts.